get through what it is I have to say. And I'm going to start by saying a little bit about dualism. And just try and set a context for why it is I say what I say, why I write what I write, and why I'm moved in this great scripture called the Yoga Sutra. I'm moved to be absorbed in this scripture. I'm moved. I love Chitta-Vityayana. I adore Prakriti. So here we go. And yes, I got in through practice. I got in through spending a lot of time in the Himalayas with a very profound guru. And at some point, it was time to, in his words, come down from the mountain into the marketplace. But the point is that there were other influences. And one of them you should know about was J. Krishnamurti, who I knew and had the occasion to have certain experiences with. That having been said, I just wanted to set that as a kind of a backdrop, because I'm convinced that J. Krishnamurti was all about Chitta-Vritti Nirodha, but he didn't talk in terms of Yoga Sutra doctrine. In any case, there's so much that we can draw from this text today. In fact, more than ever, open doors. Doors are open. Okay. And so I want to say that, first of all, it's often said, I don't think I need these things, it's often said that like classical Sankhya, Patanjali's yoga is a dualistic system understood in terms of Purusha and Prakriti. Yet I submit we need to clarify what dualistic means and ask why yoga had to be dualistic. Even in avowedly non-dualistic systems of thought, such as Advaita Vedanta, we can find numerous examples of basically dualistic modes of description and explanation. Elsewhere, I suggested the possibility of Patanjali having asserted a practical metaphysics, that is, in the Yoga Sutra, the metaphysical schematic of seer and seeable is abstracted from yogic experience. Experiences are not fitted into a metaphysical structure. This approach would allow the Yoga Sutra to be interpreted along more open-ended, epistemologically and morally oriented lines without being held captive by the radical dualistic metaphysical scheme. Despite intentions to explain the experiential dimension of yoga, purged as far as possible from abstract metaphysical knowledge, many interpreters have fallen prey to reading the Yoga Sutra from the most abstract level of the dualism of Purusha and Prakriti down to an understanding of the practices advocated. In other words, they have engaged in a top-down reading which elicits the concrete, namely action and experience, from the abstract metaphysics theory. They then proceed to impute an experiential foundation to the whole scheme, informed not necessarily from yogic experience, but from the effort to form a consistent worldview which rests in a presumption of a disjunctive duality that culminates in a radical dualistic finality or closure. Patanjali's philosophy is not based upon mere theoretical or speculative knowledge. It is indeed founded on, and therefore elicits a practical, pragmatic, experiential, perceptual, not merely inferential, theoretical approach that Patanjali deems essential in order to deal effectively with our total human situation and provide real freedom, and not just a theory of liberation or a metaphysical explanation of life. Now, those comments having been said, I'll get to what I've really written for this. Reflections on liberated consciousness. I've elsewhere described yoga as a theory-practice continuum, a philosophy and discipline taken as a whole that unites or integrates theory and practice. Yoga presupposes the integration of knowledge and activity. There can be no scission between theory and praxis. The Yoga Sutra is a philosophical text where praxis is deemed to be essential. Without actual practice, the theory that informs yoga would have no authentic meaning. Yet without examination and philosophical reflection, including psychological introspection, there would be no meaningful striving for liberation, no goal, as it were, to set one's sight on. Patanjali contributes, I believe, a form of philosophical investigation that, to borrow John Tabor's descriptive phrase for another context, can properly be called a transformative philosophy. That is to say, it is a philosophical perspective which does not, quote, stand as an edifice isolated from experience. It exists only insofar as it is realized in experience. And of course, we have Vyasa's famous quote, "By yoga, yoga is to be known. Yoga progresses from yoga. One who cares for yoga forever remains in yoga." It is crucial then to take the philosophy seriously as a necessary grounding for practice, and in the process of yogic discipline, including study, reflection, contemplation, meditation, see what the implications of the philosophy can be ethically, epistemologically, and so on. One of the philosophical issues explained or emphasized by Gerald Larson, who sadly can't be with us today, in his introduction to Yoga, India's philosophy of meditation, is the difference between intentional awareness and non-intentional consciousness. In other words, as I understand him, looking at Yoga Sutra 1.2, Yogaschittavritti Nirodha, which means yoga is the cessation of the functioning of ordinary awareness. We're to see this, in other words, what Jerry's suggesting is that we're to look at this in a very hard philosophical sense, because Patanjali wishes to stress the non-intentionality of consciousness in contrast to the intentionality of awareness. Taken in an Indian context, the intentionality of awareness refers to the idea that mental states are for the most part about something, having some sort of content, whether that content be an object or a state of mind. And where the beginningless wheel of becoming is a metaphor for samsaric or mistaken identity, that is, self-identity distorted by the afflictions, revolves for all embodied life forms. And non-intentionality refers to consciousness that has no content, that is a bare, content-less presence, which is neither object or subject in terms of the intentionality of awareness. The question that I wish to pursue here is, in the context of yoga, how are we to understand the nature, structure, and functioning of intentional awareness? Why does Patanjali highlight it? Why is it problematic? Why does it get in the way of clear insight and predispose human life to dukkha? In other words, chittavritti is, for Patanjali, where the action is, where yogic discipline is to be applied, where, for example, the 5 kleshas, which clog the functioning of the mind, creating dysfunction, and the mysterious conjunction between the seer and the seen, or seeable, termed samyoga, are rooted. They're rooted in the mind. The yogi must become aware of his or her mind and its total functioning if freedom is eventually to arise. There is no escape from the mind, my dear friends. Indeed, as Vyasa states, it is in and through the mind that both bondage and emancipation take place. There is a tremendous weight given to the role of klesha by Patanjali and Vyasa. The kleshas being ignorance, the root affliction, out of which arises egoity, asmita, I amness, attachment, raga, aversion, dvesha, and clinging to life, or fear of death, fear of non-existence, avidya. Despite the clear association of property as intentional awareness with the bondage of ignorance, there are no ultimate grounds for purporting that property is to be equated with or subsumed under the afflictions. In yoga, the world is clearly affirmed, deemed to be real, all forms of property being composed of the 3 gunas. To conflate property with affliction itself implies that as a product of spiritual ignorance, property is conceived as a reality that the yogi should ultimately abandon, reject, avoid, or discard completely. There is a subtlety to the dynamic of kleshas in that the afflictions undergird the whole of intentional awareness masquerading as true self, of a misconceived subject-object duality within property. Vyasa treats Liberated as a synonym for Avidya. In short, Liberated is one powerful vritti, in that it is rooted in the fundamental error through which we misinterpret or misconceive existence itself. And Vyasa, Vachaspati Mishra, and Vijnana Bhikshu all correlate the 5 afflictions with the 5 categories of fundamental misconception or error, Viparya, classical Sankhya. Sankhya, however, uses the term aviveka, an absence of discerning knowledge of the nature of Purusha, which the teachers of formal logic place under the category of non-apprehension, akhyati. Yoga, it should be noted, considers ignorance to be a misapprehension. The definition of ignorance being seeing the non-eternal as eternal, the impure as pure, dissatisfaction as happiness, and the non-self as the self. Interestingly, Vyasa's commentary on Yoga Sutra 223 becomes an exposition of various definitions of avidya, of the failure to see. Avidya is the failure to see clearly. He lists several alternatives for understanding the ignorance that lies at the root of a person's sense of worldly involvement and selfhood. According to Vyasa, the present conjunction of samyoga is caused, is caused by avidya producing a mentality or mind of its own kind. Patanjali states in Yoga Sutra 224, the cause of samyoga is ignorance. Vyasa's commentary makes it clear that it is avidya understood as the subliminal traits or habit patterns, vasanas, rooted in erroneous knowledge, viparya jnana, that is the cause of contact and the resulting bondage of self-identity. This is the theory of the nature of avidya as favored by the Yoga school. Throughout his commentary, Vyasa uses the word adarshan as a synonym for avidya. The other terms, and so there are other terms commonly used. I just wanted to make that point. So there's this mentality of its own kind, this avidya-born sense of self that is the cause of, that is how ignorance manifests, and that causes some yoga, which causes yoga. So, samyoga, according to Vyasa, is a result of epistemic distortion, a profound state of confusion of self-identity. Asmita or egoity constitutes the major affliction that permeates the principle of individuation, thus leading to the ongoing mistaken identity of authentic selfhood with ordinary awareness. Asmita, in a sense, embodies samyoga and is a subjective aspect of the object or content-oriented intentional awareness, the I amness seeking to become real through the things of the mind and the world. The unconscious compulsion to identify with something, in order to create a sense of self, is structured out of ignorance and mistakenly maintains egoity as its center in relation to an objective world, so the self and the world are reified. The task of the yogi lies in the gradual overcoming of the samskaras of yutan, of emergence, that generate an extrinsic and afflicted self-identity, or the externalization of selfhood in its worldly attached modes, and then the simultaneous cultivation of the impressions, the samskaras of nirodha, cessation, and the eventual establishment of selfhood in its intrinsic spiritual nature. I'm suggesting that the pivot of Purusha's entanglement within Prakriti, as it were, manifesting as an intentional, volitional, and grasping awareness, chitta-vritti, is epistemological, and it is here that we should look for an opening into the meaning of yoga as chitta-vritti nirodha. Thus, I elsewhere asked, what kind of cessation is Patanjali actually referring to in his classical definition of yoga? What does the process of cessation actually entail for the yogi, ethically, epistemologically, ontologically, psychologically, and so on? Chitta-vritti is an intentional, Chitta-vritti is indeed an intentional ordinary awareness then that functions as the seed mechanism of afflicted identity from which all other vrittis and thoughts arise and are self-referenced in the karmic patterns of ignorance. That is, unenlightened states of mind. It is the chitta-vrittis are confused and mistaken identity, not the flow of prakriti, including mental processes, thoughts, and experiences in total, that must be brought to a state of definitive cessation. In this regard, I've suggested that chitta-vritti nirodha be understood as a cessation of mistaken identity, of the misidentification with the transformations of the mind. Arguably, I just wanted to say this, that this sense of self then, as seen. So what yogis did, what Patanjali is trying to do is highlight the discernment between the seer and the seen as self. As self. The seen as self. And I'm trying to qualify that in a way that trying to make sense of this process of nirodha in this light. So arguably for Patanjali, in the gap between the subject and object, as this self is seen in relation to the world, this egoity in relation to the world, the gap between the subject and object, the observer and observed, the thinker and thought, lies the entire misery of humankind. That's what I'm trying to say about the scene. Why does he highlight the scene? Practical metaphysics. Practical metaphysics. Now, to be sure, there is a transcendence. And I've spent a long time trying to show, and so many of you, the importance of transcendence in yoga. There is transcendence of all mental content, as well as any identification with an object in asamprajñāta samadhi. And the why is there? This being for the final purification of the mind in nirvijja samadhi. Mind is made nirvijja. That is the crucial point. Nirvijja is the state of liberated mind, based on realization of Krishna. That's how I'm seeing it. But let me try and say more here. It would be misleading to conclude that higher samadhi then results in a permanent cessation of the life of the yogi. One has stepped outside the epistemological and moral barriers of intentional awareness and sees prakriti as a non-binding reality through the power of liberated consciousness, chitti shakti. Now in this regard, the issue of attachment is very important to take up, right? Attachment. It's attachment. That's our problem. Yeah. Watch out. Relationship is inherently binding. You can only marry your booty. Attachment. What is attachment? What is attachment? It's a klesha. It's a translation of the Sanskrit word raga. So attachment, from this perspective, is the self as seen in relation to the world it sees, which is in effect a failure to see. That is attachment. So, and I'll repeat that if you want.
Yes.
It is the sense of self stuck in the mind in relation to the world, trying to become real through the things of the mind. That is attachment. And that is not the true state. That is not our natural state. Our natural state is Purusha, and the mind's natural state is pure Sattva. Now, detachment then results when we cease to locate the self in the seen. We dissolve that craving to become real through the things of the mind. And therefore it results in that. Now, obviously, there's more to it than just that. But essentially, detachment is a high-level knowing. Tanjman makes it very clear. It's a high-level knowing, free of all craving or thirst for the gunas. Higher dispassion results from the discernment of Purusha. It's a knowledge-based realization. So, non-attachment or detachment is, in its deeper meaning, I suggest, not a physical or metaphysical renunciation of property. You don't have to renounce property. You simply have to be liberated from the self as seen. And that does the job, but it's hard work. It's harder work than renouncing the world. And we can go into that more another time. But therefore, in other words, there is a kind of eliminative dualism that dispenses with the fallacy of the self functioning as an intentional awareness, self as seen. Ego. Ego. Not that ego represents the whole of ahankara. It's a pretty petty bit of it. It's not the whole of ahankara. So in this there's the possibility for liberating ahankara to be something that maybe it was intended for. As with buddhi. Because they cease to get in the way. They can become something else and illuminated in the light of the Purusha. To confuse then the underlying processes involved in the cessation of ignorance as being the same thing, or as necessitating the need for a radical elimination or dissociation with our psychophysical being, as I suggest, to misunderstand the intent of the Yoga Sutra itself. In other words, an eliminative dualism that dispenses then with the fallacy of the self functioning as an intentional awareness can lead to an enriched cooperative dualism, where ultimately Purusha and Prakriti are finally allowed to be together without the presence of any defiled understanding, aligned in a space of non-opposition, balance, luminosity, wholeness, and a clarity of knowledge in the integrity of being and action. Now I'm just saying the door is open for that. That's all I'm saying. The door is open. Indeed, I would add that this yoga of transcendence, which is the basis for this transformation, the transcendence of afflicted identity. And allows for another aspect of the same yogas, chitta-vritti nirodha, of making whole, making Prakriti whole. And that's the greatest jewel. And the hardest kind of practice. One who sees then the distinction between extrinsic and intrinsic identity. Self as the seen and seer, egoity and seer, discontinues the cultivation of self-becoming, Yoga Sutra 4245. That is, one ceases to seek an identity through objects, ideas, intentions, as one sees that it is an inherently dissatisfying state of affairs. That theme is also in Yoga Sutra 351. The mind then has a dual role as a vehicle for levels or degrees of afflicted identity as an intentional awareness, where one's sense of self is dependent on objects of experience, and which is properly directed through yogic discipline. including forms of samprajñāta samadhi, leading to purification and illumination up to the experience of vidyāti. Following this, there must be dispassionate awareness even toward this high-level discernment. A non-acquisitive attitude, indeed, a non-intentional awareness, must take place at the highest level of yogic discipline. Dharma mega samadhi presupposes that the yogi has cultivated higher dispassion, the means to the ecstatic consciousness of a samprajñāta samadhi, where through ongoing cultivation, the mind appears in its purest nature as non-intentional, perfect sattva. And that takes place in the level of prakriti. The dispassion toward not a rejection of knowledge and power, not a rejection of power, but dispassion toward, is the key to ultimate purity of mind. In order to have that purity of mind, don't get caught in the cities, but they're fine if you become wise. That's my reading. So be wise first. Don't forget to be wise. And that's the highest power for siddhi. The culmination of the yoga system is found when, following from Dharma Mega, the mind and action are free from affliction, self-inflation, all coverings of impurity, and one can no longer become deluded or confused with regard to true form. According to Vyasa and other commentators, one to whom this high state of purification takes place is designated as a jivan mukta, one who's liberated while alive. And Yoga Sutra 355 tells us that kaivalya is established when the sattva, or finest luminous aspect of the mind, has reached a state of purity analogous to that of Purusha. Nirodha at this highest level of awareness does not mark, then, a definitive disappearance of prakriti from Purusha's view. For the liberated yogi, the gunas as the chitta cease to exist in the form of intentional consciousness and its samskaras, vrittis, and fixed ideas of selfhood that formally veil authentic identity. Thus, there is an epistemic dissolution going on that liberates the mind and dissolves those gunic identifications into their source. That has to go on. So there's an epistemological emphasis on being, rather than ontological, which could result in throwing the baby out with the bathwater, as it were, throwing out property for the sake of liberation. There's something I didn't read.
We got about 5 minutes. That was totally wrong.
Yes. Going back to some yoga. This is written in the Integrity book. It's a thick book, so sometimes you have to fish things. But page 133. Vyasa stresses that it is the particular conjunction of avidya in relation to the inward individual consciousness, pratyeka cetana, and not simply the impersonal abstract conjunction of Purusha with gunas, metaphysically conceived, that is specifically pointed to here. So the emphasis is on our particular property. It's our property, personal property. We need to liberate our property. So you have to go within. So again, there is, this is in line with yoga's more psychological and epistemological approach to reality, in contrast to a metaphysical ontological approach. I was saying, I think it supports what I'm trying to say. The point to be made here is that in yoga, prakriti can cease to perform an obstructing role through the uncovering of knowledge. In effect, prakriti as chitta has become purified, transformed, illuminated, and liberated from the grip of the kleshas, bringing the seer and the world to a state of luminosity, which is part of Chris's quote, recent quote. Sattva is key here in its dual role, depending on its predominant influences, tamas and rajas, or the presence of purusha. Through yogic discipline, sattva transcends the gunic limitations and relinquishes even its own discriminative discernment. This is a truly profound insight. A truly profound insight.
Could you repeat it?
That Prakriti relinquishes its attachment to knowledge. That space of detachment can function through the mind. Because you can get caught up in knowledge. You need to be free from the known, as Krishna already said. Free from it. The mind then outgrows the contracted nature of the self as the seen and has become whole. No more subject-object fragmentation persists in the mind. The ultimate sacrifice of one's limited sense of self has been made and the seer is established in true form. Now the relationship between the purified luminous sattva of Prakriti and Purusha is also articulated, for example, in Yoga Sutra 4.4, where Prakriti in the form of the one mind initiates into being individualized minds, nirmana chittas, through the medium of the bare I amness. Here, as suggested by myself and Chris Chappell, the one mind can be conceived as being mahat or buddhi, as purified sattva associated earlier with kaivalya. Moreover, Patanjali tells us that Prakriti gives birth to a special meditative quality of mind that is without residue and pure, thereby transforming the yogi's vision and knowledge experience of the world. And I think Vyasa's commentary talks about it. And Aranya also talks about the capacity to create a new mind. That is obviously not enslaved. Now, I'm finishing. My point is that the crucial philosophical distinction between non-intentional consciousness, purusha, and awareness, both intentional and non-intentional, or the discriminative discernment in one's awareness between purusha and prakriti, need not result experientially or practically in a radically separate or dissociative relation between purusha and prakriti. Through a process I have elsewhere referred to as the sattvification of mind, it is the mistaken identifications or misidentifications born of ignorance that are dissolved, not prakriti herself, which is on the contrary transformed, purified, and illuminated. Prakriti is liberated from the sense of trying to self itself. And the seer abides in true form. The full emancipatory stage of kaivalya, of which yoga practice ultimately aims, is not so much then a state of spiritual isolation, as is frequently interpreted, as it is a state of non-attached seeing, not only of the transcendence of purusha, but also of the play of prakriti. Thus, the yogi achieves a spiritual autonomous freedom that is not only a freedom from the world, born of the vidya, but from the bondage of afflicted awareness. In other words, this world born of the bondage of afflicted awareness. That is the world that is transcendent. Also, there's a freedom there can be a perceived freedom for the world. Through a balance of theory and practice, metaphysical discrimination of purusha, and ethical engagement with the manifestations of prakriti. There is no proof that yoga either ends in duality or eliminates the potential for an ongoing cooperative duality. And in closing, absolutely closing, to that special moment where the clock just fits the occasion. I just wanted to read, because this is an issue brought up at the beginning of the afternoon about Avidya. I'm just saying that there is this potential. Having expounded a central foundational definition of yoga, Patanjali pragmatically lays out various means of liberation, through which the pure power of seeing, is revealed. In what state, being or consciousness, may Purusha be said to dwell in Kaivalya? Perhaps Kaivalya is a transition to a non-dualistic state, the unmodifiable, immutable Brahman, or one indivisible reality acknowledged in schools of Vedanta. And I'm not saying I care, it must be. I'm just saying perhaps. Perhaps. The Yoga Sutra, having done the work of providing practical guidance that leads to Kaivalya, remains silent and lets the experience or realization itself answer. And that's the part of the genius of Patanjali. He leaves it open there. And so I just wanted to say then that yoga, yes, the emphasis can be on Purusha realization. And that's the basis of transcendence, which is the foundation for being truly responsible in life. That's my argument. So yoga is not simply Purusha realization, it equally implies getting it right with property. And that includes all the big issues of the day. That does not make it selling up to the world. That brings about the power to do something about our problems. And that is not softening Kaivalya, that's making it an even more extraordinary work than just leaving the world behind. Maybe you have to go through whatever you have to go through. But I'm just saying that, to me, is an emphasis that I'd like to give. To be sure, the yogic path and all its knowledge, power, and glory must be transcendent. The path must be transcendent. We can't always be seeking self. We can't always be practicing to attain something because we lack something. That's not what yoga is about. Ultimately, we don't lack. We already are what we're seeking. But we must become fully conscious. One must, as it were, step outside the vehicle of Prakriti and dwell as the consciousness of Purusha, as the foundation for true form. Yet I want to suggest that transcendence need not be taken to mean a static finality. Abiding in non-afflicted, disengaged, formless, transcendent, blissful oblivion. Rather, more elliptically, Patanjali may well have set the stage for an inclusive awakening, allowing for a convergence and engagement in life, including relational life, with an integrity and fullness that perhaps knows no bounds, wedding together spiritual autonomy and true responsibility, of transcendence and wholeness. Now that, I would like to suggest, is a maturity yoga, which I feel is implicit in the meaning of nirvana, samadhi, the possibility of which we must not overlook or close the door on. Thank you for your time.
Ian, I'm a little bit quizzical about the word dualism. And whenever we think of dualism through, as Evan was talking about earlier, we always bring our own prism to whatever terminology we approach. And it seems that the embeddedness of cosmic dualism, the embeddedness of our notion of good versus evil, gets transposed into a demonization of Prakriti and a royalization of Purusha. And I'm wondering if you might be able to comment on that as another level with which we must run interference as we seek to understand what I think is better labeled as a reciprocity philosophy rather than a dualistic philosophy.
Right. There's nothing wrong with dualism, but what kind of dualism? And a reciprocity philosophy. And I mentioned a transformative philosophy, which opens one up into a new say transcendence, for some, Aurobindo talked about this, for some transcendence is the end, but there's a room for further evolution, he said. And therefore, there's more to it. It's ongoing evolution, bringing more consciousness into form. So, but I agree, a reciprocity philosophy incorporates the dualism and perhaps sheds greater clarity on what the problem is, rather than getting caught into having to bring everything into fitting into a dualistic structure in order to make sense at the end of the day of what liberation can be. So can you say something else?
No, that's good. Good. All right. Yeah. Take yours on the top.
I know you touch on it in your book. In the second pada, the sutra that's Kritartam Prati Nashtam Apyanashtam, that's that kind of tricky sutra that has brought in the notion of the plurality of Purushas, that's seeming to be the consistent commentarial take. And I just would appreciate if you could talk a little bit about how that corresponds to the notion of some individuals ceasing their identification, in your words, identification with Prakriti and somehow ejecting in that fashion, but yet the Prakriti still operates in a manner for other Purushas. Yet I would assume that in your view, it's not as if these bound Purushas have ejected, have died, have gone into that final samadhi. They're in this kind of Jiva Mukti stage, as it were. Anyway, regardless of the last part of what I just said, if you could just elaborate more a little bit on how you frame that tricky sutra in line with your general position.
So your question is on the notion of plurality of Purushas.
And that sutra itself, which is typically been taken as a kind of recognition of plurality of Purushas and a...
This is 222.
I think it's somewhere around that. I don't have the number. Regard.
So plurality of Purushas is a tricky one. The notion of a plurality of Purushas in some way doesn't seem to make sense that Purusha is omnipresent in consciousness. Yet plurality of Purushas seems to me as giving integrity to the individual. The buddhi. So there's a plurality of Purushas insofar as there are different manifestations of the buddhi that can carry that jiva mukti space. Now, the sutra that says the world dissolves, but for others it remains.
Yep.
That to me is the world of affliction. It's the seen. It's the self is seen.
So it still just toes the line of your translation of Sutra 1-2 to carry that over into that sutra. Thank you. We're not going to do that.
Unfortunately, that's all the time I have for questions for Ian, which are, I was told to cut it Okay.
No good.
Do you mind if we do one or two more questions, Stephen? You're okay with that? All right. We have some questions back here. Now I'm getting pressure on booty chains. This is crazy. I will take two more, so here's one.
All right. Thanks, Ian. I really enjoyed your talk, as I'm sure everyone else did. And I just one quick comment, or one comment on, I like the idea that this sort of, this movement, which could almost be thought of as circular too, of going into Pratiprasava, but back then out into Vintanan, perhaps again and again and again. And one concept that I was thinking of as a sort of maybe a frame for understanding, I'd be interested to see if there's a resonance here, is in Theravada Buddhism. I think there's a conception that when an individual is enlightened, it doesn't sort of turn them into an automaton or a robot, just like every other enlightened person, but rather enlightenment manifests through the unique characteristics of the individual who achieved awakening. And so, see sort of a parallel with what you're saying, that when a yogi or yogini enters into Kaivalya and they sort of emerge out of that state, then they are manifesting that enlightened activities through their specific prakritic constitution. And so Prakriti is, as Anna was talking about earlier, sort of perfected by that process, and then enlightenment is going to be uniquely characterized by that individual in their circumstance and in their relationships.
Your turn, John.
Yeah. So the question of individuality, and we've often conflated egoity with individuality, with ahamkara, and there's a lot of problem there. In the sense of, ahamkara is this vast, all-pervading I amness out of which the rest of the universe manifests, and due to the rajas. So when I say sattvification, which allows for possibilities in the world, then it would mean that the rajas and tamas then follow from that wisdom. So then there's the possibility of transforming the rajas from being a bad state of mind to being a power of the evolution, and the tamas from being a stabilizer of form to hold that consciousness rather than a diluted form of existence. Now, if this sounds a little bit like having your cake and eating it too, then that's all right. But you have to know how to bake the cake. You have to know how to bake the cake. And that is, so the work is more than meditation. Meditation is absolutely essential, but it's bringing into action. Bringing into action. So in order to do that, you really have to face the chitta-vritti dynamic, which is holding the sense of self. That's why Patanjali highlights it, I'm saying. It's holding the sense, which is often unconscious in people. So until you're ready to be conscious, until you're conscious of your suffering, there's not too much that can go on. So, as far as awakening, nevertheless, everything that is in existence, including Avidya, is there for the purpose of experience and realization. So, in a sense, Avidya sets the context for a path. It has a liberating quality to it from the right perspective. Indeed, how could it not? It's not this bad thing. You've got to go and kick out of bed, get rid of, dissociate. You have to work with it. In effect, you could say that it is the natural process of the growth and development of in the finest sense, of the buddhi, so that buddhi becomes truly awakened. So a lot of this work is really an unfolding that uncovering that sattva, that beautiful sattva, which is the key to everything. It's the bridge, the bridge between, you could say, Purusha and Prakriti. Any question about the scene, self as seen?
I just wanted to add, just on that scene, can I have that? Just not a long comment, just my reading of Dharma Vinashtam, the term nashta is in general translated as destroyed, annihilated. But if we go back to the term itself, etymology, the root is rasa adarsani. That's all Panini says about. In by the Sutra Buddha you have ta, nasta. So it means it has been invisible. That's all.
Okay, that's good.
Okay, all right.